On behalf of Baker McKenzie and Trench Rossi Watanabe, I'd like to welcome and thank you all for joining today's webinar called Making the Paris Agreement Deliver. My name is Renata Amaral. I'm a partner at Trench Rossi Watanabe, São Paulo. I'm also the head of the Sustainability and Climate Change practice here in Brazil. And I'm a member of our global climate change group at Baker McKenzie. Today, I'm joined by Baker McKenzie partners Ruth, Dawes, and Andrew Hedges from the Sydney and London offices. We are delighted to have two very special guests, Andrea Bonzanni, Director of International Policy at the International Emissions Trading Association, IETA, and Charles Di Leva. He's a partner at Sustainability Frameworks. We have just followed the developments at the Climate Summit in New York and saw how the private sector is engaged to invest and fulfill its commitments to cut emissions, as well as to pursue co-benefits in several dimensions, including nature, climate, people. And now we are getting ready to COP27 in Egypt. So during this coming hour, we will explore how emerging markets can use Article 6 mechanisms to channel finance for transformation. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. To ask a question, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We will address questions at the end of the presentation, and if it's not possible, we may contact you later with further information on your doubts. A recording of today's webinar will be provided in a follow-up communication by email. And now to kick off our webinar, I will turn it over to Ruth to introduce herself and explore how Article 6 can assist in delivering climate finance. So over to you, Ruth.
Thank you, Renata, and thank you everyone for joining us here today. As Renata said, I'm a partner here in our Sydney office at Baker McKenzie, specialising in climate change, sustainability and environmental matters. And I'm also a member of our Global Climate Change Steering Committee. So today, we wanted to talk about Article 6 and how it assists in delivering climate finance. And this session will just be a brief overview of Article 6 and set a bit of context for the further discussions that will follow with Andrew Hedges and our very special guests. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in terms of defining Article 6, various rules were finalised at COP26 late last year, and there are three key aspects that came out of those rules. The first is the Article 6.2 mechanism, which essentially enables participating parties, being countries, to trade in internationally transferable mitigation outcomes through what's called cooperative approaches. There is some potential for private sector to also be involved, but that's largely dependent on the nature of the cooperative approach that's determined between the two countries. The second key prong is the Article 6.4 mechanism, and that's essentially expected to build upon existing project-based mechanisms under the Kyoto Protocol, namely the Clean Development Mechanism and perhaps to a lesser extent, joint implementation. And this new mechanism is being dubbed the Sustainable Development Mechanism, and various framework has been put in place for the transition of CDM projects onto the Sustainable Development Mechanism. And here is an opportunity for both public and private sector to engage in these projects together. And then the third prong is a framework for non-market-based approaches under Article 6.8, which is intended to capture actions that drive cost-effective mitigation and adaptation without relying on market-based approaches or mechanisms that use transferable or tradable units. And so Article 6 rules enable countries and the private sector to begin actively engaging with activities under Article 6.2 and Article 6.4. Next slide, please. So this is a table that was recently produced by the Climate Change Authority in Australia, and it provides, by way of comparison, what is an ITMO, an internationally transferable mitigation outcome, and what is not an ITMO. And I think in the ITMO column, one of the key points there is that ITMOs are authorised by the host country, and they're authorised for a purpose. And so that purpose could be for use towards another country's nationally determined contribution, or it could be used towards other international mitigation purposes. And that latter term is not defined under Article 6. And so there is some flexibility for countries to determine what that purpose is. And one potential purpose could be for use of those units in the voluntary carbon market. In terms of fostering climate finance, it's important to note that under Article 6.4, there are two types of mandatory contributions. One is a 5% contribution to the adaptation fund that it triggers at first issuance of the Article 6.4 units. And there's also a 2% contribution to go towards delivering overall mitigation in global emissions, or OMGE. Now in the not ITMO column, there can still be Article 6.4 projects, but these would not have host country authorization for use towards another country's NDC or other international mitigation purposes. And also it's been identified that just the voluntary carbon market in its ordinary course would not be considered to be an ITMO unless it was ultimately pulled in under one of the Article 6.2 frameworks that were referred to just earlier. Next slide, please. So just prior to COP26, the World Resources Institute did quite a useful stocktake of NDCs, and they found that 83% of NDCs submitted by countries may use international market mechanisms under Article 6. So that's quite interesting, because it shows that there's expected to be quite a significant uptake of these mechanisms going forward. Also recently, by way of context, the Task Force on Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets looked at the corporate offset commitments and found that 90% of corporate offset commitments originate from companies with headquarters in what they dubbed the Global North, or the Northern Hemisphere. But ultimately, they will require international purchase agreements beyond the Global North or South geographical concentrations. And so really, in order to meet those pledges or commitments, buyers and sellers will need to trade credits across the world to ensure sufficient supply, but also to allow everyone to benefit. Next slide, please. And here is an example of different approaches to Article 6. Various countries around the world are starting to express what they intend to do, or have already taken steps to engage with Article 6. Again, this resource has come from the Climate Change Authority. And here we can see that the approaches, there are a number of contrasting approaches. For instance, Switzerland has stated that its NDC will be met partly by using ITMOs, and it has already entered into various bilateral framework agreements under Article 6.2 with other countries in the world. By way of contrast, the USA does not intend to use Article 6 mechanisms to achieve its target. But as can be seen across the slide, there really is no one size fits all when it comes to a country's engagement with Article 6. And that's to be expected because each country will have its own views on this and its own views on how it intends to implement its NDC. Next slide, please. So in terms of the implementation of NDCs under the Article 6, some of the key takeaways are Article 6 clarifies how international carbon markets involving governments should function. It supports the transfer of emission reductions between countries. It incentivizes the private sector to invest in climate-friendly solutions. And it's expected to create conditions for international carbon markets to thrive, including continued significant growth in private sector investments through voluntary carbon offset projects. And it paves the way for cooperative approaches that allow the financing of technologies needed to meet climate targets and raise climate ambitions of participating parties. And it's a potential additional tool to wider multilateral climate finance. Next slide, please. So we have the rules, but there's still a fair amount of work to be done. So this next slide just sets out some of the key near-term steps needed to start getting ready for engagement with Article 6. So what we will start to see across the world is countries appointing designated authorities to deal with the Article 6 framework. There are going to need to be approval and authorization procedures and oversight processes that will come out of those authorities. We'll need to see the introduction of simplified monitoring methodologies. And really, it's going to be quite important for there to be processes in place for the tracking of ITMOs and the various reporting and accounting requirements, including in relation to corresponding adjustments to ensure that there's no double counting of ITMOs between countries or participants. Next slide, please. And finally, one very important thing to come out of Article 6 is the level of engagement and cooperation that can occur between countries and the private sector. And on this whole, in this whole spirit of cooperation, we've seen an initiative come out recently, the NDC Partnership Finance Strategy, which is work that's being done by various countries and global organisations to assist in the implementation of NDCs. And Renata, that was all from me in terms of just setting up a little bit of context for the next session to follow. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ruth. Great insights on Article 6 context and implementation. Thank you. I'd like to invite our guest speakers now, Andrea Bonzanni and Charles Di Leva, to join us. Andrew, please free to introduce yourself and conduct the discussions with our super special guests. Thank you.
Great, thanks. If we go to the next slide, thanks. I'll introduce myself and then maybe hand over to Andrea to introduce himself, and then we'll dive into it. I'm, as mentioned earlier, I'm a partner in the London office and I work across the energy transition. I've got a particular specialty around climate markets and the investments around it. And personally, I'm quite excited about Article 6 and the potential it brings to create transformative change for the planet. So Andrea, do you want to just introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Hi, everyone, and thanks for the invite. Great to be here. So my name is Andrea Bonzanni. I'm International Policy Director at the International Emissions Trading Association, IETA. We represent over 250 businesses, private sector companies that are members of IETA, and we strive to be the collective voice of business on carbon markets globally. And IETA played a key role in the development of Article 6, starting from the Paris Agreement and the inclusion of this article and the market-based mechanisms under 6.2 and 6.4. And then since then, we followed very closely the difficult negotiations that reached a milestone last year in Glasgow with the approval of the guidelines that are now being implemented and form the basis of the market-made mechanisms that are being developed. So great to discuss further with you, Andrew.
Great. Look, we've got some questions. This is going to be a dialogue. But I guess just to set this up a bit, do you think why did we want to have this webinar? And being frank, there's still a lot of work to be done on Article 6 to make it operational. There's a lot to get through at COP27. But there's also a lot for emerging markets to do, as we saw with Ruth's presentation at the end there. If they want to engage with this, they want to be set up for this, they want to encourage participation under Article 6 programs or projects. And that sort of begs the question, is it worth it? Is it, is this a tool that will fundamentally offer real opportunities for countries such that it makes sense for them to engage and to participate? So that's what we really want to explore today is, what are some of the pros and cons around this, both for countries, so we are thinking about countries with this, but also then how does that inform what the private sector should be thinking about when they're thinking of investment opportunities? So to kick it off, Andrea, how important could it be? Do you feel that this could be a significant tool for climate finance?
Well, the potential is enormous. The cooperative implementation of climate targets, both for countries and corporates, presents significant advantages. And it goes down to basic economic theories. We have countries that have abundant capital and they exhausted the low-cost abatement options that they had. And on the other hand, we had a set of countries in the global south that struggle to access capital and have access to lower abatement cost opportunities. Article 6 provides the framework to channel this capital and this need for greater abatements to the jurisdictions, the locations where it is more efficient. So it's a basic mechanism. It needs to be implemented, but the potential is there. And I will quote some research that IETA sponsored using the GCAM model, one of the most important models used in the climate change community. We estimated that if all countries implemented Article 6, so they open to transfers of mitigation outcomes, the savings globally would be between 250 and 300 billion US dollars per year in 2030, and they could go up to 1 trillion per year in 2050 globally. That means that these funds that are saved by implementing NDCs and targets more efficiently could be channeled back into additional mitigation activity to increase the ambition, which is one of the objectives of Article 6, going back to the Paris Agreement, or they could be used especially by developing countries for to promote sustainable development and other economic development objectives that they may have. Article 6 will be a market that will reduce in size over time because as we hopefully will be successful in reducing emissions, the pool of emission will be smaller, but the marginal abatement cost will increase. So the value of each transferred ton of CO2 will be much higher. So the potential is enormous, and there are challenges, of course. The implementation is not easy, but I think we can't afford to try and achieve net zero without using Article 6 and looking at market mechanisms.
Thanks. No, so when you start talking trillions, it does feel like a game changer. But unlocking that as you say, it's challenges. Like in your conversations, because I know as a policy director, you not only work with business, but you spend a lot of time, such as the World Bank's Program for Market Readiness, talking to various countries. Do you feel that, well, what do you think are some of the challenges or the reasons why some countries might think twice about Article 6, like in particular, so the entire approach around corresponding adjustments and how tough that then makes your NDC achievement?
I think there are various sets of concerns that are legitimate and need to be addressed. On the one hand, starting from the global north, I think there's a bit of skepticism about the role of markets can play in delivering real emission reductions that are additional, that are verified. And especially in the EU, the experience of the CDM has been viewed negatively, and that is still affecting the perception of this complex international market mechanisms, even though I would argue that a lot of the shortcomings that the CDM had have been corrected through the long and difficult negotiation on Article 6 rules that that ended at COP26. On the other hand, something also important is the lack of capacity in developing countries. Implementing these mechanisms requires capacity, staff, and expertise in government departments, as well as the need to make fairly complex political decisions based on trade-offs between what you reserve for domestic mitigation and your NDC now, and what you offer on the international market for sale under Article 6. And as mentioned by Ruth before, every transfer will require corresponding adjustment, makes it harder in the short term for the country to achieve the NDC. So all these trade-offs need to be looked at. Decisions need to be made, and it's taken a bit of time for developing countries to get to the point where they can confidently make these decisions and engage meaningfully in Article 6.
Yes, I guess we'll move on to the next question, but it begs the question whether we do need to see a change in sort of Western countries' commitment to purchasing or entering into significant Article 6.2 or 6.4 driven units. Because if you think back to the Clean Development Mechanism, it really kicked off because of the EU sort of recognizing those as a compliance unit. So is that a challenge in the near term until we see sort of significant country level buyer interest that may depress the value or otherwise sort of cause queries around what is the upside of going through all the pain of getting a proper Article 6 structure set up within a country?
Yeah, well, greater buyer interest in the global north would be welcome anytime. Now we have the two major economic blocs, the US and the EU, stating that for now they would not engage in this mechanism. But we have Japan, we have Switzerland. They're looking to buy significant amounts of units between now and 2030. For both, we're looking between 60 and 80 million tons by 2030. So I think it provides a basis for developing countries to see something they can sell and they can receive benefits from. Generally, going forward, I struggle to see how we can achieve net zero without international markets. Article 6 should be about the net of net zero. Whatever scenario we're looking at, there would be some residual emissions that have to be balanced by removals, and it will not be possible for all countries to remove their residual emissions within their borders, their territory.
Yeah.
So that begs for market-based mechanisms, and we need to get there by building the infrastructure and having the right policy frameworks and mechanisms.
Well, Well, if we move on to the sort of the next topic there, and I'll fully admit I put this in for myself because perhaps you can react, but my view is that there's perhaps a little bit too much focus on, say, nature-based solutions, because that is the main sort of investment tool at the moment, say, for the voluntary market, or which people think about often emerging markets. But I think that, you know, Article 6 should be seen in the sense it's intended under the Paris Agreement, and which you can see through the decisions that have been made since, where it's supposed to be a tool for transformative mitigation activities, for deep decarbonization, for finding paths by which technologies can transfer to emerging markets and effectively leapfrog them to a point where, yes, they might have a harder NDC for engaging with it, but they will get to a better place in the medium term by transforming, you know, industrial sectors or high emitting sectors in a manner which, as you said right at the start of this part, you know, that they might not have the capital for perhaps immediately or easily available. So I guess that I'll get your reaction on that, on whether you see that as a possible path, because I think that's something that needs more engagement and focus.
Well, yeah, I think some of the fears in the lead up to the agreement in Glasgow is that Article 6 will be used as a tool by some developing countries, at least, to sell their lower cost abatement options, oversell, some would say, get revenues in the short run, and then really not delivering any meaningful ambition in the long run. Almost a year after the agreement in Glasgow, we don't see much evidence of that. We see developing countries being wary and wary and aware of what it means to engage in Article 6, what it means to commit to corresponding adjustments, and we're moving to a world in which the sectors and the projects that are subject to Article 6 tend to be the so-called high-hanging fruits. So the sectors where there's where the abatement costs are higher, and where abatement can be achieved through technology that is not yet widely available. And on the other hand, for the countries in the global north, it can be a tool to get access to those technologies, those options that are necessary, but they can't be developed within their national borders. I'm thinking about green hydrogen, which requires access to large amounts of cheap renewable energy. I'm thinking about direct air capture, CCS. So that's, in my view, where Article 6 will truly be needed and unlock some potential opportunities that cannot be unlocked without these tools.
I think the tools are coming. If you look at the sort of the supervisory body that has to make some recommendations before COP around methodologies, approach to methodologies, additionality, also the core things that had to be built out for COP27. You know, there's some really interesting stuff there. There's proposals on an approach to methodologies for carbon capture. There's a push for positive lists for additionality, where if it's a zero emission technology and it's high financial cost, then it'll be just deemed additional to be an Article 6.4 project, etc., which will in turn inform Article 6.2 approaches. So I think those tools, as you mentioned, are going to be there for countries. And I think, before moving on to the next question, for anyone who is working with emerging markets or is in the policy discussions with them, I think the key thing is to encourage, how do you think about Article 6 in terms of your own country's national interests, your own country's sustainable development opportunities and objectives, and your own NDC, and then look to create, whether it's a 6.2 partnership with another country, or it's framing what types of projects you want to happen under Article 6.4, but make them work for your sector and which will ultimately bring technology transfer to your country. Now, that's great that everyone's excited as the host country to engage, but then what about business that hopefully will bring the capital and the investment? What's your take on what is needed in the near to medium term?
Yeah, well, we have seen excitement in the business community after the agreement in Glasgow as well. Businesses were relieved to finally have an agreement on Article 6, and generally the content of the decisions was considered a positive, something business could work with. Perhaps here I can mention some of the work we've done within IETA this year after COP26. We, amongst other things, we issued a short paper, a high-level paper. It's only 4 pages, listing what we call the ingredients of success in the eyes of business to have to develop Article 6 mechanisms that work. So in the near term, what we need is essentially clarity, clarity about the intention of the host country and clarity about the regulatory framework in which businesses, project developers, or buyers, or the financial community can engage with. So clarity about what sectors will be open to Article 6 mechanisms, what the national authorities responsible for key decisions are, what the administrative procedures are, and this is all fairly simple stuff, but it really needs to be there. It needs to be clear, and governments need to show a commitment to stick to what they put in place to create confidence in business. Then in the midterm, we have a vision of a market that is interoperable between the different mechanisms that are being set up. We will have a central crediting mechanism at the UN level under 6.4. We are probably a couple of years away from the moment in which credits can be issued under 6.4. Between now and then, we have disparate 6.2 approaches. And the way they've been developed is through bilateral agreement between a buyer and a set of sellers. And now projects that generate unit under, for example, the Swiss bilateral agreement can't be used for compliance in Japan, which is the other major Article 6.2 mechanism that has been developed. Going forward, I think it would be very helpful for business to have some sort of interoperability and know that when something is being developed and it generates Article 6 credits, it will generate a credit that is tradable, that can be held by private sector in an exchange account, for example, in a registry, and then can be used for different purposes. I think this will really help markets to scale and financing to flow into projects that generate credits under Article 6.
Yeah, and just to return to that idea of the near-term sort of intention and the investment environment, I think I'd just add that it is more than just the regulatory or policy environment in which the Article 6 opportunities arise, but it's that wider, traditional foreign investment strategy. And we're seeing that as sort of voluntary market investments increase in scale, the level of upfront investment clients are making, then there is a much stronger focus on, what is the foreign investment treaties that are relevant here? What is the tax risk? What is the country risk? And we're looking at a political risk insurance structure. So I think that to the extent that in building on that idea that emerging markets could proactively engage with Article 6 as a tool to channel finance as they need it, then the flip side of that is they also need to do the hard yards to create the enabling environment to bring in sort of, if not frictionless, but less friction in the ease with which people make decisions to invest. Well, I think unless you had some final thoughts, Andrea, we were going to move to our next speaker.
No, that's fine. Happy to move on. Perhaps I'll just mention that there's still significant work to be done at the UN level, especially to operationalize the 6.4 mechanisms. But now, in my view, the key decisions need to be made in the national capitals, both in the global north and the global south. Policy frameworks need to set up at the national level. Without these frameworks, it would be really hard to kickstart and scale these markets.
Well, thank you, and please stay on in case we have some Q&A at the end from our guests, the participants. Thank you.
Thank
so
you.
we move on to the next. So I'd like to sort of not change gears, but just build perhaps upon what we've been talking to. And Charles, can you introduce yourself before we dive in, and then we'll explore some thoughts.
Sure, Andrew. I'm Charles Di Leva. I'm a partner at Sustainability Frameworks. I retired from the World Bank last year. I was there for almost 30 years, and during the entire tenure at the bank, I was advising on the climate treaties, on climate finance, and I retired as the Chief Environmental and Social Standards Officer, as I said, last year.
Great, well, thank you. And you've kind of neatly set up why we thought you'd be a fantastic guest, because you've been sort of effectively at the pointy end of multilateral initiatives to create positive change in a variety of countries and markets. And that is effectively, we all live in this challenging environment where the only way we can sort of save the planet is to do something transformative this decade, but at the same time we need to get it right. You know, perfection is the enemy of the good, but also it is also the potential for failure. So perhaps moving to this first question over there, Charles, in your experience, what are some of the tensions and issues and challenges that can arise when something is seeking to be transformative, sectorial, nationwide, regional-wide, but ensuring that it also works for, say, civil society?
Yeah, it's a great question. I was reminded in thinking about our chat today that it goes back to the UNFCCC, the Climate Change Treaty in 1992, when at the same time it was being negotiated, the Rio Conference on Sustainable Development was taking place. And all of these environmental and social basic principles, like engaging civil society, engaging indigenous peoples, ensuring that projects, policies, and programs go through environmental and social assessment, and that it's done with meaningful public participation, is embedded in all the international agreements. It's there in the promotion of sustainable development in the original 1992 treaty. And we look at the Paris Agreement, it's compounded. References to ensuring that there's, in the preamble alone, references to human rights, indigenous people, vulnerable groups, civil society, gender, all of these that recognize that civil society, while committed to the notion that we need to reduce greenhouse gases, is also committed to the notion of ensuring that governments are going to do it in a way that is sustainable and that looks at the potential impacts of these kinds of activities on civil society. And I think part of why the clean development mechanism did not work well, especially in the early years, was that it wasn't looking at projects in a truly sustainable fashion. It was understandably concerned with how do we show that we're reducing emissions, but there is that social component that is manifest in many of these concerns that you see civil society have.
And just, I guess, exploring on that, can you expand on where you think you've seen it sort of go wrong or sort of in the road?
For sure. I think, we've seen a number of especially you see it, I think, in the land use area, where projects that would seek to offset carbon emissions through various land use schemes, or that at least intended to include REDD+ safeguards, failed to do the deliberative work with civil society in order to achieve projects that in some cases, multilateral banks or perhaps equator banks that are committed to environmental and social safeguards were unable to finance because of that. We've seen very, very slow uptake of many of the carbon offset projects that have to do with anything that has to do with land rights. And I think one of the concerns we have going forward is that to get to scale, and when one talks about, for example, as Andrea was mentioning just before on green hydrogen, in many parts of the world, to do green hydrogen is going to require really large scale land use decisions, whether it's hydro or large scale solar or large scale wind. And in so many developing countries where this opportunity presents itself, we have very weak capacity, or we have lots of challenges to deal with appropriate land use ownership, land rights. And unless we can really deal with these as well, we potentially undermine the downstream credibility of some of these carbon market activities. And for many years, there have been certain countries in the UNFCCC world that have had extensive concerns about markets for that very reason, because they think that in their societies, they have not been able to really clarify the rights within a market environment in many of these countries.
Well, I guess it sets up the next question in that, you've worked with the World Bank for years, you've worked, I'm sure, with a range of multilaterals and DFIs. Some of those issues you've talked about, you can either make the argument that their involvement with sort of creating the ground conditions for Article 6 opportunities within a country could help address those issues in a way that maybe just a private sector investor couldn't. So that's, I guess, the positive spin. Or on the flip side, is that actually correct? Or is there evidence that those DFIs have succeeded in creating the conditions where more appropriate decisions are made?
Yeah, it's a case-by-case decision, I think, for both the private actor and the public to decide. I think certainly you can see with the rules that were set up by the Green Climate Fund, by the Adaptation Fund, by the Global Environment Facility, and by all the multilateral development banks, for them to engage in programs or activities as they're set out under the Paris Agreement, their financing, their engagement depends on also doing good environmental and social reviews to be sure that civil society has been taken into account, that the land rights, the labor rights, all of these things that are looked at, so that the environment in which they're lending their highly valued capital, whether it's guarantee finance or grant or concessional lending, is done so in an area for a project that has been well vetted and that can indeed be sustainable. And I think what we're seeing with all the multilateral banks and the development finance institutions is almost a harmonized approach to being sure that there's sound environmental and social assessment of these project activities, that when they're supporting developing countries in terms of their nationally determined contributions, that those NDCs are also a product that has included the civil society of those particular countries. So it's not just an NDC that comes out of a cabinet level decision, it's an NDC that both the private sector and the public sector can see as a tool that really has support of the entire government. So the activities consistent with the NDC are also going to be seen as promoting sustainable development. And of course, there's a lot of work to be done on that, but I think at least under 6.4, you're going to see a real push for these kind of rules to support the mechanism, the sustainable development mechanism that we expect to see coming out of 6.4. And under 6.2, these large scale country to country kind of exchanges, may also need to look at, how sustainable is the activity that is being part of that market exchange.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I guess, and we should move to Q&A shortly, but when I listen to that, I think it encourages me to think about how, although we're saying that Article 6 might be an important tool for a country to select, it all derives as well out of that entire process around the NDC. So it's all tied up. How is that NDC is developed? How has that sort of got buy-in from civil society? And then ultimately, where does that lead to in terms of policy decisions around trying to access, technology transfer through Article 6 or what have you?
Yeah, exactly. And Andrew, you mentioned an important term just a little while ago, that for a lot of this financial capital to go to many developing countries, there has to be a sense that you can address the political risk. In looking at the political risk, any financing entity is going to want to know, is this a project that if this particular government administration changes, or if it has big effect on civil society, perhaps it's changing subsidies or agricultural practices, is the underlying environmental and social review one that shows that political risk can be managed because it's been well designed as part of the overall political economy of the country in which the finance is being provided.
I was checking Q&A while we were chatting, and we haven't got any questions yet. I'll encourage people to jump in now, but I'm going to put Renata on the spot, grabbing our moderator. I guess just listening to what Charles has been saying, what we've been discussing, Brazil had its recent decree. It's talking about sort of how it tackles its own sectoral plans, etc. Do you have some sort of, I guess, your takeaways from how that plays out in terms of a national discussion around priorities and who bears what responsibilities?
Yeah, Andrew, thank you so much. And Andrea and Charles, it has been so inspiring to listen to you and so many interesting points. Yeah, in Brazil and in several other places, I believe, especially in Latin America, where we are now trying to implement a compliance market. It's amazing how we don't see, at least in our current regulations, provisions that are dedicated to safeguards and to this environmental and social co-benefits that we should see in the projects, especially in places like Brazil, when the vast majority of the projects are located in the Amazon, where we have local communities and all the social challenges to be addressed. This is one of the major criticism that has been made to the current regulations that we have, the fact that we are not, in fact, paying attention to the basic foundations of these projects, and how we can, as Charles mentioned, bring comfort to the investors that the social aspects of the projects are taken care of, especially considering that we have vulnerable communities in the middle of places where almost nobody goes, like in the middle of the Amazon, and how to check that the investment is really going and reaching the right people. And in connection with that, I was thinking about raising a question to Andrea and also Charles, or not a question, but to see your comments on how do you see the different sectors within the private community dealing with this matter, or dealing with the future commitments or the targets that they have been already placed, because in several countries, like in Brazil, we are now under the discussions on how to regulate different sectors of the economy, and we see that one of the major challenges is to address the differences between the sectors. We have sectors that are really well developed in a sense that they have been the usual suspects for a long time. So if you take the oil and gas, energy, mining sectors, they have been dealing with these matters for a long time, and they are kind of maybe more prepared to this climate challenges and projects. Whereas we also have the new companies that have to deal with this subject with a different approach, like the consumer-facing companies, the fashion, the cosmetics, the food companies, and they have to deal with that in a very different way, because if they have a reputational problem today, they will face tomorrow the fact that the consumers will not buy their product. So it's a different risk in a sense if we compare with the energy or mining, oil and gas sectors. So I would like to hear your thoughts about this different sectors approach, and if you see relevant differences on how they will probably be addressing Article 6 implementation, and also their commitments regarding net zero and decarbonization.
Perhaps I go first. Brief comment. I agree with your analysis, Renata, and I don't think it's something specific to developing countries. We're seeing that globally. That are sectors of the economy that have been targeted first. As you mentioned, the energy industry primarily, mining, the so-called heavy industry. But now as we move closer to net zero, all sectors need to play their part. And I think there's no way of escaping that. Also, there are sectors in which achieving zero emissions is easier than others. And thinking about the power sector now, we have technologies available. It's more about deployment and implementation, and sectors in which there's still significant work to be done in terms of research and development, perhaps offsetting those residual emissions that will remain even in a net zero world. But I think Article 6 comes in as a tool that allows hard-to-abate sector to play their part by promoting and supporting reductions of road, as well as perhaps further down the line paying for removals that are permanent at scale, so that net zero will be really net zero, and emissions will be offset by removals.
Yeah, I agree with Andrea, and I guess I add a couple other points. On one hand, all sectors share the need for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and the methodologies on tracking GHG reporting on each of these sectors is work that's been done by the multilateral development banks. So whether it's transport or agriculture or energy, they have common methodologies to help do those kinds of greenhouse gas assessments. Where I think it's different is that some sectors are going to have more winners or losers than other sectors. So for example, one of the big social questions coming out of Paris is the issue of just transition. So for example, in the coal sector, there's been a ton of work in countries like India, Indonesia, South Africa, where you have large scale mining that in which large parts of the sector are going to be transitioning or losing current sources of employment. So how do we create a situation where we can satisfy the Paris Agreement call for just transition in some of those sectors? The other thing that might be interesting is because we've talked about 6.2 and 6.4, 6.8 is called a non-market approach, but I don't think that's really such a helpful way of looking at it, because you could have some very good aspects in the building sector by certain energy efficiency requirements where you can actually create winners by finding new ways of building energy efficiency, building solar into homes that can be done through policy and legal changes that can create winners in certain sectors.
Well, thank you all three. We're about to finish up, but there is one question which I've had a look at while you've been talking, which I can start on, but others can jump in if they want. And the question was interested to learn about the speaker's view on global carbon markets outside of Article 6 that are created by business and the interaction of such markets with transfers under Article 6, which is a good question. I think that's the crux of what the voluntary market, for example, will be facing in the near to medium term. And frankly, the sort of the policy discussions within countries, which this webinar is sort of encouraging, the sooner that happens, the better, because whether it leads to a decision by a country that it wants to sort of push hard on Article 6 and less on creating opportunities for the voluntary market, or shifting those emission reductions or removal opportunities to Article 6 or not, to my mind, it's critical, as Andrea said, about the need for intention, that the sooner we have a clear path by which way a country is going, the more you can encourage investment, either as business as usual through voluntary markets or under new mechanisms. But this is probably strongly in your area as well, Andrea, so maybe you can have the last word and then we'll wrap up.
Sorry, Andrew, were you saying for me or for Andrea?
Oh, sorry, for Andrea.
Okay.
Well, no, I think you represented the complexity of the interaction between Article 6 mechanisms and what we now call the voluntary market. The interaction would be complex because Article 6, especially 6.2, is a complex beast. It's decentralized. It would be a collection of different mechanisms. Well, the existing market created outside of Article 6 can play two key roles. On the one hand, it can provide the standards and the methodologies to issue credits that then can be brought under Article 6 by the host country when they decide to authorize those reduction and turning them into ITMOs that have value under Article 6. But also, I believe there's room for a market for corporates that will work outside the framework of Article 6. So no corresponding adjustments. The credits generated will not count towards the NDC of any country other than the host country where the projects take place. And these credits can be used by corporates to make claims. And we are in the process now to agree on a set of claims that will be valuable for the corporate, will be understandable by consumer and the general public, but also will guarantee that the environmental integrity of the system is maintained. So no double counting, no baseless claims, and I'm confident that we will get there. And because the contributions of the voluntary market to emission reduction is significant, and it would be a pity to forgo that just because of lack of clear accounting and clear claiming by corporates.
Mm.
I think the voluntary are going to also follow voluntary market standards, which are not that different than the environmental and social principles that I was referring to earlier as well.
I think we're going to have to wrap up because we're on the hour and we like to be timely. But just in case you have any final words, Renata, but I just wanted to put a shout out for those interested in these topics. The previous session we did that is on our hub looked very much at what is the emerging themes coming out of new climate laws in emerging markets. So it touches on some of the points we're at the end there. And there's another session coming up that'll be a little bit before COP27, which is going to be a bit of a deep dive into really what needs to be done at COP to finalize or take Article 6 to the next level. So a snapshot of all the various open issues and where the parties are going in.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew. And special thanks to Andrea and Charles for the brilliant contributions. And please contact us if you need any further information or if you have still any doubts. Thank you.